Camping used to be my favorite thing in the world. There was nothing better than getting away from everything, sitting by a fire, and just being out in the wilderness. But after that night, I don't think I'll ever go again. It was supposed to be a simple trip, just me and my 3 best friends, Nick, Jason, and Mike. We'd been talking about it for weeks, planning everything down to the last detail. The spot we picked was perfect, deep in the woods, far from any people, quiet, peaceful. We arrived in the late afternoon just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. The place was everything we'd hoped for: tall pines, a small stream nearby, and the kind of silence that only exists that far from civilization. We set up 2 tents, one for me and Jason, the other for Nick and Mike. Then we got a fire going, cooked some food, and settled in for the night. As the sun disappeared completely, the temperature dropped fast. The sounds of the forest grew louder, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the occasional splash of water from the stream. It was relaxing, until Nick noticed something. "Did you guys see that?" he asked, his voice sharper than usual. Jason and I looked up. "See what?" I asked. Nick stared into the trees for a moment, then shook his head. "Nothing. Thought I saw something." We let it go, but Nick seemed different after that. He kept glancing around, shifting uncomfortably. After a while, we all decided to call it a night. I climbed into my sleeping bag, feeling warm and comfortable, but sleep didn't come easily. Nick's reaction stuck with me. He had looked genuinely freaked out, like he had seen something he couldn't explain. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be an animal. I held my breath and listened. The steps weren't close, but they were moving around the camp. Then I heard something else. A zipper. The sound of a tent opening. "Nick? Mike?" I whispered. No answer. I turned to Jason. He was sound asleep. Carefully, I unzipped our tent just a little and peeked outside. Nick was standing there, just outside his tent, staring into the trees, completely still, like he was waiting for something. I crawled out of my tent and walked up to him. "Nick?" I whispered. He turned his head toward me slowly, his face pale in the firelight. Then he said, "Who set up the 3rd tent?" I froze. "What 3rd tent?" Nick lifted his arm and pointed. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. There, just beyond our camp, half hidden in the trees, was a 3rd tent. Small, black, old, and completely zipped shut. Jason and Mike must have heard us because they came out of their tent, rubbing their eyes. "What's going on?" Jason asked. Nick didn't look away from the tent. "That wasn't there before," he said quietly. Jason's eyes widened. "No way. No. That wasn't here earlier." Mike swallowed hard. Maybe someone set it up after we got here." But he didn't sound like he believed it. None of us did. It didn't make sense. Nobody could have set up a tent that fast without making any noise. We had been awake just minutes ago, sitting right here. We would have seen them. We should have heard them. We all stood there, staring at the tent. Then Nick took a step forward. "I'm checking it out." Before we could stop him, he reached for the zipper. But before he touched it, something moved inside. Not the wind, not an animal. Something shifting. Slow. Deliberate. We all stepped back. It didn't make a sound. No breathing. No footsteps. Just the unmistakable feeling that something was in there, watching us. That was all we needed. We ran back to our tents, grabbed our gear in a panic, and shoved everything into the car. We didn't pack properly, we didn't talk, we just moved. Fast. 10 minutes later, we were speeding down the dirt road, leaving the campsite behind. Nobody spoke for a long time. It wasn't until we were miles away, back in town, that someone finally broke the silence. "Nick, we have to go back." I turned to him, shocked. "What? Why?" "To see if it's still there." The thought made my skin crawl, but deep down, I knew he was right. We had to know. The next morning in broad daylight, we drove back to the site. It felt different in the sun, less menacing, almost normal. But when we arrived, the tent was gone. Not collapsed, not packed up, just gone. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there, no sign that it had ever existed at all. But we all saw it, and something inside it saw us too. I've always loved camping. The silence, the fresh air, the feeling of being away from everything. But after that night, I think twice before going anywhere too remote. It was supposed to be just another weekend trip. Nothing unusual. Just me and 3 of my closest friends, Ryan, Jake, and Matt. We'd done this plenty of times before, so we knew what we were doing. We picked a spot up in the mountains, far from any towns or people. Just us, the trees, and the stars. We arrived in the late afternoon just as the sun was starting to dip. The place was beautiful. Tall pine trees, a small stream nearby, and the kind of quiet you don't get in the city. We set up 2 tents, built a fire, and got comfortable. Everything was fine. Normal. Then the night came. After dinner, we sat around the fire, talking and joking, the way we always did. The air was cool, but the fire kept us warm. We weren't thinking about anything except how good it felt to be out there. And then we heard it. A voice. Distant. Software almost like a whisper. "Did you hear that?" Matt asked, his face suddenly serious. I had. But it was faint. So faint that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. Ryan shook his head. "Probably just the wind," he said. But he didn't sound convinced. We tried to ignore it, but then a few minutes later, we heard it again. Closer. And this time, it said my name. I went completely still. My heart started pounding. I looked at the others. They had all heard it too. "That's not the wind," Jake muttered. We sat there, listening, waiting. The fire crackled, the trees swayed, but the voice was gone. For a long time, nobody spoke. Then Ryan cleared his throat. "Maybe someone's out there," he said. "Maybe they need help." It sounded logical, but something about it felt wrong. Still, we grabbed our flashlights and decided to check it out. We walked slowly into the trees, our lights cutting through the darkness. The voice had stopped, but we kept going, following the direction it had come from. The further we went, the heavier the air felt, like we weren't supposed to be there. Then just as suddenly as it started, the voice was back, saying my name, over and over, same tone, same pitch, no emotion, like a recording stuck on repeat. Then, silence. Our flashlights trembled in our hands. The air felt thick, heavy. I turned to Ryan, but before I could say anything, Jake whispered, "We should go back." And that's when we heard something moving in the trees. Not footsteps, not an animal. Something shifting. Like it was adjusting itself. Watching. We ran. We didn't talk, didn't look back. Just sprinted through the dark, stumbling over rocks and roots until we reached the camp. And when we got there, we stopped cold. Our tents were open, our gear was scattered, but nothing was missing. No footprints, no signs of anyone, or anything having been there. It was like something had passed through, touched everything, and then left. Nobody said a word. We just looked at each other, breathing hard. We didn't argue. We didn't try to be brave. We packed up in 10 minutes and got in the car. As we drove down the winding mountain road, nobody spoke. The only sound was the tires on the gravel and the occasional rustling of the trees outside. But as we reached the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and I saw something. Not a person. Not an animal. Just 2 small glowing lights, like eyes, watching. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to know if the others saw it too. But I know what I saw, and I know we weren't alone that night. It all started out like a typical weekend with my buddies. We were planning another one of our annual camping trips, but this time, we chose a spot up near the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. We've been to plenty of places before, but something about this one felt different. It was a bit more remote, more secluded, which seemed perfect for a few days of hiking, fishing, and just getting away from it all. We pulled up to the campsite, a patch of land surrounded by thick trees with a small lake tucked behind the ridge. Everything looked great, and the weather couldn't have been better. We set up our tents by the lake, built a fire pit, and cracked open a few beers as the sun dipped lower in the sky. It was a perfect night, and we joked around, roasted marshmallows, and caught up on life. We'd been planning this trip for months, so the usual camping banter felt good. Around midnight, after we'd all stuffed ourselves with snacks and talked about whatever weird thing popped into our heads, we started to head to our tents. It was an old-school camping trip. No phones, no distractions, just nature. But as I lay in my tent, listening to the crickets and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees, something felt off. Maybe it was just me being tired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. I brushed it off and tried to fall asleep, but that nagging feeling didn't go away. At one point, I swore I heard something like twigs snapping just outside the tent, followed by a quiet rustle in the bushes. It could have been an animal, maybe a deer or something, but it sounded deliberate, almost too intentional. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds kept going. I got up and unzipped the tent, hoping it was just some small critter making its way through the forest. But when I stuck my head out, everything was quiet. The fire pit was just a pile of glowing embers, the lake calm and still, and the trees swayed gently in the wind. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the uneasy feeling stayed with me, even as I tried to go back to sleep. It wasn't until the next morning that I started to think something was wrong. When I woke up, the guys were already up and making breakfast by the fire. The sun was up, but the air had that crisp chill to it, making it perfect for coffee and bacon. But as I stepped out of the tent, I noticed something strange. The zipper on my tent door was halfway undone. I remembered closing it tightly before going to sleep, and I had checked it twice. But now it was left open just enough for someone to slip in. I didn't say anything to the guys at first. I figured it was just an accident, or maybe I'd forgotten to zip it all the way. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside, or at least near the tent. It wasn't just the zipper. It was the way things felt. Off. Like we weren't alone. The day passed normally enough. We hiked through the woods, did some fishing by the lake, and just enjoyed the quiet. But as the sun began to set again, that weird feeling crept up on me once more. The sounds from the night before started to repeat themselves, only this time, they were closer. It wasn't just twigs snapping. I could hear footsteps crunching through the leaves like someone was walking around the campsite. I glanced over at the guys, but they didn't seem to notice anything. Maybe I was just paranoid, or maybe I was tired from the hike, but it was hard to ignore the way the trees seemed to move differently that night. I tried to focus on the fire, to stay distracted, but my mind kept wandering. We all eventually turned in for the night, though none of us slept much. Around 2 a.m., I was wide awake, staring at the dark ceiling of my tent. It was dead quiet, except for the occasional crackle from the dying embers outside. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping sound like fingernails on canvas, and I saw something. Not a person, not an animal. Just two small glowing lights, like eyes, watching. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to know if the others saw it too. But I know what I saw, and I know we weren't alone that night.